Wuthering Waves 2.6 story could have been one of the best arcs in the game. It had everything: a determined leader, a headstrong priestess, a tragic sacrifice, and even traces of a love story caught between fate and defiance. On the surface, it works. It looks poetic, emotional, even heartbreaking. But once you start pulling on the threads, it all unravels. Contradictions pile up, rules of the world get bent or ignored, and you're left with a story that's more confusing than cathartic. That's what I want to talk about today, not because I dislike Iuno's story. In fact, I think it has immense potential, but because that potential gets undercut by the way it's written. So let's dive into Iuno's questline piece by piece and break down what worked, what didn't, and why Wuthering Waves keeps tripping over its own world building. We'll be talking about spoilers for Iuno's story quest in patch 2.6, so finish the quest first, then come back to watch this video. After the battle at the Earthrend Wedge, we return victorious to camp. Everyone's celebrating, but Iuno is missing. No matter who you ask, nobody remembers her name. Even Augusta, who arguably spent the most time with her, dismisses the feeling as Darktide-induced dissociation. Rover doesn't accept this explanation and goes off to search for Iuno, finding only a fading sliver of moonlight that disappears with the wind. Abby pops in and gives Rover the encouragement he needs, proving he is not the only one who remembers her. With this, he returns to Tetragon Temple in search of clues and is greeted by Priestess Lilibet, who tells him that she has found a past record mentioning a priestess named Iuno. But the truth is that Iuno's existence was erased during the fight with the false sovereign. The cost of her defiance was her very being. Rover, as the unwritten one, untouched by fate, is the only person who can still remember her. This keeps Iuno's specter trapped in the realm of chaos, a place between life and death, between existence and non-existence, where Iuno is endlessly reliving moments of her life. Rover resolves to bring her back from the brink by delving into the realm of chaos himself and further anchoring Iuno using his own body as the vessel. Together with Lilibet, you go to the place where Iuno died 3 years ago, and though the dark tide is trying to stop you, you manage to make your way into the realm of chaos. Within, you find Iuno's specter, and together with her, you find, relive, and reclaim fragments of her memory, of her existence, taking them within you and creating a Lunarum bow that eventually becomes Iuno's moonring bow. With this bow, she fights against the dark tide, firing arrow after arrow that erases her existence, but Rover swoops in at the last second, anchoring Iuno with the bracelet that she gifted him. This connection completely anchors Iuno to reality, effectively resurrecting her and returning her to the real world. However, everyone still doesn't remember who Iuno is, and they both chalk it up to this being the cost of what they have done. Instead of death or complete erasure, the cost is everyone's memories of the heroine who sacrificed everything she had for Septimond. I will not deny Wuthering Waves was able to deliver an emotional story that hit me. I was invested in Iuno as a character and in her plight of being chained to a cruel fate without ever having the chance to do anything to fight back against it, which is exactly why I can't stop myself from pointing out the contradictions that topple the foundation upon which Iuno's quest is based on. First off, let me just say that Iuno's quest does nothing to explain or justify any of the writing and or world building inconsistencies I have talked about in my previous video. We still don't fully know how prophecies work, a good reason for Rover's duel with Augusta was still not given, and none of the contrivances get addressed. With that out of the way, let's talk about the foundation. Iuno's entire quest is based on the premise that her existence was erased. This was the cost she had to pay to defy fate and give Rover and Augusta the opportunity to fight the false sovereign. To understand what that means, we need to take a good look at what the real-world effects of her disappearance are. Erasing her existence doesn't mean that fate manipulated time and made it so that Iuno was never born. It means that her existence is erased only after the act of defiance, and to cover up any gaps in history, fate manipulates the memories of the people to believe that she never existed. Iuno's actions and impact on the world still exist, however, but they were attributed to other people, as we can see when Rover was having a verbal conflict with Avidius, and when people were saying that Rover is to thank for being able to dispel the miasma and anchor the false sovereign. It's here that we meet our first inconsistency in the form of the report found by Lilibet. If Iuno's existence was erased, then all of her actions should have been attributed to someone else. That's why people credit Rover for dispelling the miasma and anchoring the sovereign. So why does a report exist with Iuno's name on it? How can nobody remember her, yet one piece of paper survives untouched? This makes it look like only the past 3 years of Iuno's existence were erased. But the quest is explicit. Multiple times throughout it, we get confirmations from both Rover and Iuno that her entire existence was the cost. Those two ideas don't line up. If her entire existence is the cost, then no record of Iuno should have remained anywhere in existence. Iuno herself says that every trace of her existence was erased, a sentiment that is further confirmed by Rover, who states that Iuno traded her existence. The dialogue leaves no room for interpretation here. This is not a partial removal or time manipulation. Iuno was supposed to be removed from Solaris entirely. After all, you can't still retain a part of something you've traded away, can you? Now I get why the record exists. The writers needed breadcrumbs to lead Rover into chaos, but the execution breaks their own rules. If they wanted this clue, there is an obvious fix. The record should have had Rover's name. Imagine how jarring it would be for Rover to find his own name in a priestess report from 3 years ago, long before he even arrived on Solaris. That alone would have been enough to spark his search for Iuno without breaking the logic of her erasure. As it currently stands though, we have Iuno, who sacrificed her entire being for a noble goal. Fate erases every trace of her, but somehow overlooks a random piece of paper. A record that somehow survives, casually placing her as a priestess that somehow still existed 3 years ago after her erasure. Next, let's talk about the actual event from 3 years ago. We've never heard of this battle before Iuno's questline, so the first question is, did this battle actually happen, or was it fabricated by fate, just like Lilibet's report? Let's assume that this battle was part of the original history and actually took place long before Rover met Iuno. If true, Iuno should have still been erased from the history of this event, so again, that report should not exist, or it should have been in Rover's name. But let's put that aside for a moment. If this battle was real, then in the original history, Iuno must have survived it, because if she had actually died back then, we never would have met her later in Septimond. On the other hand, if this event never existed before Iuno's erasure, then fate literally created a fake event just to justify the false record of Iuno's death. But why would fate bother? In fact, creating a fake event to justify a fake record mentioning Iuno specifically goes against the very idea of erasing her entire existence. Why would you need to justify the death of someone who wasn't supposed to exist in the first place? So it stands to reason that the more plausible theory is the first one, where the battle actually happened in the original history, but Iuno somehow survived it. How? We do not know, because the cutscene that shows us her battle takes place in the realm of chaos, and it is very hard to distinguish which parts of that cutscene are objective facts and which are symbolic metaphors. And this gets at the real problem. Wuthering Waves leans too heavily on poetic vagueness. The devs wanted a beautiful, symbolic story filled with meaning. Sure, it looks good on the surface, but without being supported by clear in-world rules, the whole thing starts to collapse. Without a concrete answer from the game, we're left to assume that the battle from 3 years ago ended with Iuno surviving somehow. Maybe all she did back then was defy fate and nothing else. Or maybe she fired a lesser amount of moon arrows, just enough to not have her disappear completely. This theory is somewhat supported by what Iuno says when you go and meet her at night under the Lunarum bow. Each arrow ate away at her existence, but never did it fully erase her. Instead, it made people slowly forget where she was seen last, or sometimes even her name. And since we're on the subject of the Lunarum bow, let's talk about the one inside the realm of chaos. First, what is chaos? It's basically Wua's version of limbo, a realm between life and death where every possibility exists and doesn't exist at the same time. Think of it like Schrodinger's cat, except here, the cat isn't just alive and dead, it's also drinking tea, on fire, and maybe even a clown. Chaos is the box containing all of these possibilities at once. That's why Lilibet and Iuno consider this a threat, because with so many possible choices, you could get lost and swallowed up. But Rover seems to have no problem navigating it, if I'm being honest. But sure, let's just chalk this up to it being very difficult to recreate such a chaotic realm through actual gameplay. Inside Chaos, we find a specter of Iuno and search for fragments of her memory so that we can make Iuno whole again. The way the game presents the rules for this system is rather simple. Search the realm of Chaos, relive her memory so that those memories get anchored to the Rover, then rest so that the memories Rover has anchored can be manifested and grow as the Lunarum bow. Once manifested, Iuno can absorb these fragments of memory that we've relived, which slowly make her more real. The danger here is that not just any memory will do. Remember, we're in the realm of chaos where every possibility exists at the same time. Chaos throws every possible choice at you, and we need to make sure that we absorb only the fragments of memory that represent the choices Iuno actually made during her lifetime. This entire process is basically us rebuilding the Iuno we've known from scratch, starting from her childhood all the way up to adulthood. Now, one of the issues that I have with this is that for Rover to be able to do this, he needs to have had very intimate knowledge of Iuno, knowledge he simply doesn't have. He would have to know almost every excruciating detail about her life to be able to make the correct choice whenever a door opens up, something that shouldn't be possible considering that the amount of time Rover has interacted with Iuno from patch 2.4 up until 2.6 was very limited. It's this inconsistency that dulls the emotional impact of the anchoring process. It's basically the same issue I mentioned in my previous video with Augusta making a reference to a heart-to-heart that was never shown. The only way I can try to fill in the narrative gaps here is to be generous and say that maybe there have been past events where Iuno and Rover bonded on a much more intimate level, but were just never shown on screen. First off, that's a big shame. Second, that could also potentially explain the flashback scene close to the start of the quest where Rover tries to return the bracelet to Iuno. Initially, I didn't know when this event took place in the original history, but by process of elimination, we can conclude that it happened after the hunt in the first half of 2.6. Why? Well, because just before the fight with the false sovereign, Iuno told us to keep the bracelet close, so we definitely had it in our possession throughout the fight, which makes the only logical moment for us to return the bracelet to be sometime after the hunt. But this bashes heads with the pre-established theory that Iuno's existence was erased during the Sovereign fight, immediately after she fired her moon arrow. We've seen multiple times that the side effects of her firing her arrows are immediate, so how can this flashback happen after the hunt? Her existence should have been erased by this point, but even so, it's the only logical place in the timeline this scene could fit because of the bracelet. And because of these two paradoxical events, this flashback's place in the timeline is left up in the air, because the act of returning the bracelet demands that this event take place after the hunt, while the act of firing the moon arrow demands Iuno to not exist during this moment. Well, I kind of went on a tangent there. The point is, these inconsistencies seem to be very commonplace in Wuwa's narrative. So let's return to the tree. We nearly complete Iuno when Chaos kidnaps her specter. Lilibet warned us this was dangerous. Iuno's specter was the only fragile rope connecting Rover, Iuno, and the world of Solaris. Without her, that rope would snap and would cause Iuno to be lost forever. And yet Rover keeps going, unguided, and conveniently stumbles across the key memory from 3 years ago. Call it luck, call it plot armor, but it undercuts the threat we were warned about. Rover then finds his way back to the Linarum Bow, where he manifests the last memories he's found. The tree is complete and the blacksmith shows up, hinting that he is Iuno's father. What he says next is convoluted, and not in a good way. Since Chaos has stolen the specter we were restoring, he suggests keeping the tree as it is and finding another specter. Now, this can be interpreted in two ways. Either he's saying we could grab some random specter from another person in Chaos and force it to absorb Iuno's memories, or he's suggesting we could find another specter of Iuno and let that one absorb the manifested memories, bringing it up to the same level of progress as the one that was lost. I would say that the first option isn't really an option at all because Rover is not the type of character to do something like that. So let's assume the blacksmith meant the second option, finding another specter of Iuno. And logically that makes sense. In a realm where infinite possibilities exist, there should be infinite Iunos, each reliving a different piece of her past. We could simply bring a new specter to the bow and let it absorb the memories we've already anchored. But Rover refuses. He insists on saving the Iuno we've been with this whole time, instead of taking the obviously safer route. Maybe because of stubbornness or maybe because of sentimentality, we don't really know. Because trying to read Rover's emotions is like trying to read a blank piece of paper. Regardless, he chooses the riskier option. Except it's not really that risky. The blacksmith warns that cutting down the bow to forge Iuno's bow could erase all our anchored memories, and that Iuno herself might have already lost the will to fight. But this line falls completely flat. We've already seen proof of Iuno's determination, first at the temple when she read our fate, and later when she shattered her focus item. Even if Rover didn't witness the second moment, the first should have been enough. Suggesting now that she might have given up feels like the writer's trying to inject artificial stakes that don't actually hold up. If this warning had come earlier, before we saw Iuno's resolve, it could have worked. It would have sowed the seeds of doubt before we had any signs showing us that Iuno had not given up. Instead, it just rings hollow. So at this point, if we take Rover's sentimentality into account, he really only has two choices. Either find the specter we lost and bring her back to the tree, or cut down the tree and bring it to her. And of course, we choose to cut down the tree. The branch floats into the air and somehow reaches Iuno, because apparently we couldn't just climb up there ourselves, grab her, and bring her back to the bow to resolve this peacefully. But fine, this cutscene is clearly meant to be read as symbolic, not literal. And given the chaotic nature of this realm, I'll rationalize it as Rover being unable to reach Iuno without the branch acting as a guide. But let's be honest, that's just me filling in the blanks with my own rules. And if anyone actually tried to scrutinize this rule set, it probably wouldn't hold up either. And that's the problem with the entire Lunarum bow sequence. The symbolism is strong, but the mechanics are weak. Rover somehow knows Iuno's memories intimately enough to rebuild her from scratch. He ignores the safer option of using another specter, and he cuts down the tree in a scene that only works if you don't think too hard about it. It looks powerful, yes, but once again, Wua relies on poetic vagueness to paint over gaps in its own rules. And just like before, the moment you start asking how or why, the whole thing unravels. Or it just causes you one big headache like it did me, because I actually had to sit down for hours to read, decipher, understand, and come up with possible solutions to fix these inconsistencies. Finally, let's talk about the gorgeous cutscene where Iuno wields her bow against the dark tide. As great as it looks, something about it doesn't add up. Rover cuts off the branch, it floats into the sky where Iuno grabs it, and she fights against the dark tide. But we know for a fact that this battle is taking place inside chaos, meaning this isn't a true battle of the spring from the original history. It's just Iuno reliving her past again. Now remember, by this point we had already completed the Lunarum bow. That means we'd already gathered the fragments needed to make Iuno whole. So logically, she shouldn't need to relive this moment again. We'd already anchored this memory when we found the journal. This battle should have already been stored in the bow, and Iuno should have been restored the second she received the branch that became her moonbow. But that's not what happens. She relives the spring battle, and at the end of it, she disappears unless Rover intervenes with the bracelet. And that makes no sense. If she really died here, we never would have met her in the present day. So why does she die this time? Why is reliving her own history suddenly fatal? It completely contradicts the rules the story has been laying out. To restore Iuno, we were supposed to relive her real moments, the ones that actually happened. Yet in this scene, she dies in a moment we know she originally survived. Unless this isn't our Iuno's past. Maybe what we're actually seeing is a version of the spring battle where Iuno did die 3 years ago. That would make for a fascinating twist. We'd be restoring Iuno, yes, but not the Iuno who fought alongside us against the Sovereign. Instead, we'd be bringing back the Iuno who died before we ever met her. That would have been a deeply tragic outcome, a bittersweet victory where the Iuno who returns has no memory of us. But sadly, that's not what the story goes for. By the end of the quest, Iuno is fully restored as if none of this was an issue. And so what could have been a bold narrative choice is just left behind as another plot hole. And since we're on the topic, let's ask the obvious. Why is Iuno only fully restored after this cutscene? Remember, the Iuno we rebuilt should still be missing 3 years worth of memories, specifically everything between the spring battle and the Sovereign fight. Logically, we should have had to relive something recent, like the moment she fired the arrow to anchor the Sovereign to bridge that gap. Without it, the Iuno we brought back should have been incomplete. But that's not what the story shows us. Instead, the quest ends with a fully restored Iuno who remembers everything. The plan, the cost she hid from Augusta, even the details of the hunt. It's presented as though she never lost those memories in the first place, and so we have another plot hole. So how do we fix this? The only way I can make sense of it is if Rover's own memories are the final piece. When he places the bracelet on Iuno's arm, he anchors those missing 3 years using his personal experiences with her. Don't ask how or why Rover can do this. He's special, remember? He can do whatever the writers want. But even if we accept that, it raises another question. If Rover's memories were enough, why go through the entire journey of collecting fragments at all? Why not just grow the tree from the start using what he already carried? Because remember, we've only gotten this far by assuming that Rover knows almost everything about Iuno through off-screen conversations. Otherwise, we wouldn't know which memories to choose from within the chaos. But here, let me try to offer a solution. Maybe the distinction is this: knowing about Iuno's past isn't the same as possessing the actual fragments of it. Rover's knowledge might simply be the guide he needs to recognize and select the real memories inside chaos. That makes sense, but it still leaves a hole. It would still leave the problem of Iuno missing 3 years worth of memories. If Rover's memories can't actually be used to complete Iuno, the bracelet scene doesn't make sense, because that would mean that the Iuno we knew in the first half of 2.6 would be forever lost to us. And since that directly contradicts the quest's ending, this theory falls apart. Rover must have something inside of him powerful enough to make Iuno whole and stop her from disappearing. So the only conclusion left is that Rover's personal memories do matter. Maybe there's a key difference between Rover's knowledge of Iuno's past and his lived experiences with her. Maybe Rover's knowledge of Iuno's past can't be used for anchoring and manifesting, but the memories of actually being with her can. That way, Iuno's fragments rebuild her history, but only Rover's own experiences with her, manifested through the bracelet, complete her existence. It doesn't fix every hole, but at least it ties a neat little bow on the paradox. Now at this point you might be thinking that's a lot of ifs and maybes, and when you're writing a story, sure, you should leave some room for interpretation, but you shouldn't leave this many blanks in the basic rules of how your world works. At that point, it stops being mysterious and starts being sloppy. And when that happens, the so-called threat doesn't feel real anymore. It just feels like empty poetry dressed up as stakes. As the story currently stands, a lot of what happens in Iuno's quest just doesn't make sense within the rules it lays out for itself. You could argue that these paradoxes exist because of the very nature of chaos, and sure, that sounds plausible, but the game itself establishes rules for how chaos is supposed to work. If you're going to bend or break them, then you need to make that clear in lore. And I don't mind that. I actually like it when a story gives me a clever in-universe reason to explain the impossible. That's part of the reason why I was so fixated on the way they decided to trick fate in my last video about Augusta's questline. What I do mind is when it's just left vague and the audience is expected to nod along and accept it without question. Even worse, you're expecting the audience to do most of the heavy lifting by coming up with ideas and theories to justify your lack of detail. At that point, it doesn't feel like clever world building, it feels like a contrived shortcut. I should probably also touch upon the importance of introducing chaos as another plane of existence. This has some far-reaching implications because chaos exists outside cause and effect. It contains every possible outcome simultaneously, and it allows fragments of memory or identity or even erased people to linger. And now Rover is, for all intents and purposes, a chaos walker. He can enter chaos at specific points attuned to the person he's searching for. He's able to anchor them back into existence and potentially pick and choose fragments of reality and make them real. Rover is reaching levels of power that could potentially bend reality to his will. He's not just a strong fighter anymore, he's someone capable of editing causality itself. With this kind of power, Rover is getting closer and closer to the realms of godhood. Given how many things go unexplained in Wuwa's main quests, it might even be worth considering that chaos could be the slippery slope that allows writers to justify anything. Resurrect a dead character? Use chaos. Defy fate? Use chaos. Want to will into existence the consequences of a choice that was never made? Use chaos. It would pretty much serve the same function as Goku's senzu beans or wish-granting Dragon Balls. It's an interesting narrative addition that has potential, but just like I mentioned in my previous video on ZZZ about using death as a narrative tool, if overused, it can make sacrifices meaningless. It also shifts the tone of Wuthering Waves into a more fantasy-like setting, rather than the futuristic post-apocalypse that it was marketed as. However, these concerns are only valid if the writers will ever mention chaos again after 2.6. As we all know, Wuthering Waves is guilty of introducing new characters, letting them have their spotlight, and then benching them for 90% of a version's lifecycle. Who's to say they won't do the same with chaos? If you were to ask for my opinion, I think the writers will want to stay clear of chaos from now on and hope we forget it ever existed. If they will ever bring it back, it would only be in some extreme, once-in-a-blue-moon scenario. But what would happen if all of these issues that I mentioned up until now didn't exist? What if the story had no plot holes? What if the narrative was airtight with no paradoxes and where everything made sense? Then this would be a whole different story. It would be the story of a talented, headstrong, and persistent woman who, rather than let her life be dictated by higher powers, took matters into her own hands and defied those which sought to control her. A priestess, both gifted and cursed, with powers of foresight unmatched by any other, and though she accepted her place as an oracle to serve her people, more often than not, her visions foretold tragedies and disaster. Plagued by the visions of her beloved people succumbing to dark forces, she desperately searched day after day, using her gift to the point of exhaustion for that one glimpse, that one glimmer of light that would shine through the darkness and deliver the salvation of Septimont. Yet that salvation never appeared. Racked with grief and desperation, Iuno questioned her entire existence. What purpose does a priestess hold if all she foretells is damnation? And so, she made a choice. If all her blessed sight afforded was endless suffering, then that sight was as useless as a lantern that only lights the path to the gallows. So she renounced it, and fired a defiant arrow at the heart of destiny itself. To pay for this transgression, fate took away her sight, but instead, Iuno obtained the power to fight against the dark tide, and with it, joined hunt after hunt in an attempt to utterly break fate. All that she had foreseen she would prevent. Yet attempt after attempt, fate was not so easily circumvented, and while the pain in her chest threatened to overwhelm her, she stubbornly rose again, unwilling to give up. Once, just once, all it took was one victory, one shift in fate's unshakable future. However small, it would prove to her and everyone that fate is not immovable. And in one battle she found it. A single soldier survived when fate dictated his death. To Iuno, this was the breakthrough that fueled every fiber of her being with a single, unrelenting thought: to draw fate's bow and release it wherever she chooses. This was what led her to formulating her plan with Septimont's effort to anchor the false sovereign and prevent the foretold calamity. But fate didn't take kindly to such acts of rebellion, and so enacted a cost. Iuno's being was wiped clean from the slate of Solaris, leaving not a trace, except for the one unwritten in this world's tale, who still bears her memory when others do not. Spurred onward by her stinging absence, he delved into the depths of the chaotic realm beyond, to find her before fate itself can have its say. And though the path was treacherous, he found her specter and kept her close, so that she could draw strength from the memories he held so dear. Through every shard of possibility, he gathered her fragments, and though fate clawed her specter away, though it tormented her with the weight of every failure, still her will did not break. But the one unwritten would not accept it. If he was the anomaly destiny could not erase, then he will write upon the priestess's tale with the ink of his own being, forever declaring her to be untouched by fate. Together, they return home and rest. Her existence remains forgotten by all but him, yet in that defiance, in that survival, she had scarred fate itself. And that will forever be a testament that tarnishes the infallibility of fate. Wuthering Waves has, without a doubt, the potential for powerful, emotional storytelling. It already shows a flair for the poetic, with moments that genuinely tug at your heart. Iuno's quest is proof of that, proof that the writers can craft something memorable. But to truly soar, the story needs to do more than gesture at meaning. It needs to respect its own world building, honor the rules that it sets, and give its poetry a foundation strong enough to stand. If it can do that, then Wuthering Waves could deliver not just pretty words, but lasting stories. I would also not be against the idea of having the writers actually select a canon wife for Rover. At this point, they've been teasing and hinting at potential romantic involvements with so many characters, I don't care who it is anymore. Just let Rover be together with somebody already. I'll even take Brant at this point. Anyway, if you've reached up until the end, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what your thoughts are down in the comment section below. And if you've enjoyed the video, please support the channel with a like and a sub. That's going to be it for me, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, have a good one.